Hello again, and thanks for joining us on our expedition through the text of the Bible. We are expediting through Judges 15 today in 5 minutes. And you can get this PDF on our website at tobelikechrist.com. You can get a lot of other stuff on tobelikechrist.com. You should go ahead and check it out and look at all the stuff. Click on all the pages. Judges chapter 15, we are talking about a judge, naturally, and that judge is Samson. In the last chapter, Samson got married, and then he gave riddles to some guys, and then he had to kill 30 Philistines. If you haven't read that chapter, you should go back and take a look at that one. Hopefully you've read the text of chapter 15, though, and you already know what's going to happen in this chapter. When did these events take place? The period of the Judges spans several hundred years between approximately 1450 BC and 1000 BC. Let us now gaze upon the map and find out where the events of this chapter took place. Samson's parents lived at a place called Zorah, which was in the territory of Dan. Samson married a woman in the last chapter, a Philistine woman from the city of Timnah, and Samson kills 1,000 men in this chapter at a place called Lehi. The main character of this chapter is, of course, the judge, the 13th judge of Israel, Samson. He was a Nazirite, which was like a special vow that someone could make to the Lord. And his birth was announced by the angel of the Lord, so he was quite significant. The Philistines are our second character or group of characters. The Philistines were allowed to oppress God's people, the Israelites, for 40 years because the Israelites had been unfaithful to God, but Samson was coming as their deliverer. And then, kind of an odd character for this chapter, some animals, actually. 300 foxes. And if you're part of PETA, I'm just going to give you a trigger warning on this video because Samson uses these foxes to avenge himself on the Philistines in a rather, let's just say the Humane Society wouldn't be pleased about it. So that takes us over to our outline, our first section, Foxes and Fire, verses 1 through 8. Now, it's important to remember what happened in the last chapter. Remember, Samson's wife kind of betrayed him and gave away the answer to his riddle to those 30 Philistine men, and Samson was really angry about this, and he left his wife at his father-in-law's house, and he went away. Well, in this chapter, after some days, I think the text says, Samson returned to Timnah to be with his wife. But evidently, when Samson left the wedding in rage, his father-in-law assumed that he didn't want his wife anymore because she had betrayed him, and he ended up giving her to another man. Samson was furious that he no longer had a wife, and in order to get revenge on the Philistine people in general, he went out and he caught 300 foxes, and he tied their tails together, and he put torches, he tied torches in between their tails, and then he released the foxes into the Philistines' crops. So they would run through the crops because their tails were probably on fire, and the fire would spread throughout the fields. When the Philistines found out that it was Samson who had burned all their crops down, they went and they killed his father-in-law and his wife. So after he burned their crops down, Samson went and fought with the Philistines, and the text says, quote, that he struck them hip and thigh with a great blow, which I think is basically a phrase meaning he won quite handily and he defeated the Philistines. Now to our second section, verses 9 through 20, the Spirit of God and the jawbone of a donkey. The Philistines, after this, really wanted Samson dead, and so they camped in Judah and they prepared to raid a city named Lehi. Now, the Israelites really didn't want this trouble, and so they went and tried to capture Samson and arrest him themselves. They took 3,000 men to arrest one man, Samson, and to turn him in. Samson surrendered himself to these Israelite men, and he allowed them to bind him with 2 new ropes and to be taken away and given over to the Philistines. However, it was kind of a trick. As soon as the Philistines came out to meet him at Lehi, the Spirit of God rushed upon him. He broke free of his ropes. He found the jawbone of a donkey, and he killed 1,000 Philistine men. So it's quite a formidable guy. After the battle, God provided Samson water from what's called a hollow place there at Lehi. The translation there is kind of interesting if you look up the background of the way that that's translated. But anyway, the end of the chapter says that Samson judged Israel for 20 years. Chapter 15, verse 20. Now, that's not the end of Samson's story. It kind of seems like it wraps up here, but we have more to talk about in the next chapter. Let's wrap up today with our application. When you read the Bible text for yourself, verse by verse, chapter by chapter, like we've been doing, you'll find that many of the famous Bible characters were not anything close to perfect men. In fact, you might find that their lives are full of some things that make you raise your eyebrows and frankly, some sins, some shortcomings that you weren't taught when you heard about these characters in Bible class in Sunday school. In Samson's case, he got in trouble with the Philistines because he disobeyed God and married a Philistine, which he wasn't supposed to do. Somebody in my comment section mentioned Jacob, and my brothers and I were talking about Jacob when we were home together, and how Jacob had plenty of faults in his life. You read the story of Jacob, you're like, is Jacob a good guy or is he a bad guy? I can't really tell. The Old Testament is a record of how God used imperfect people to accomplish his will, and Samson is the perfect example. The only perfect man appears in the New Testament, and that's Jesus. Jesus is the man to idolize. As much as we admire and look up to many of these heroes of the Old Testament, they were nothing compared to Jesus.